Welcome to our last small group session of February. This month, we've learned about praise and our calling in connection with the law of Christ. In this session, we will continue exploring Christ's command to love God and our neighbor through the willingness to reconcile. There are two types of reconciliation: reconciliation with God and with our neighbor. If we can better understand how our reconciliation with God works, then we can comprehend the importance of reconciliation with our neighbor. In order to get a better grasp on both types of reconciliation, let's look at the parable of the unforgiving servant. Please pause the video to read Matthew 18:21-35. In Jesus' parable, we can study the relationship between the servant and his master. When finally called to settle his accounts, the servant begs for his master's patience so that he can gather the money to pay the debt, which was so large that it was going to be impossible to pay. However, the master has compassion and forgives his entire debt. The servant was never going to be able to repay the large sum he owed to his master, and yet perhaps he wanted to try out of his pride. Every sin we commit is a debt to God, and this is why we are reconciled with Him. It's foolish to think that as sinners we could try to satisfy God by paying back our debts to Him. He sent His Son so that Christ, once brought and eternally valid sacrifice, could erase our debt and allow us to be reconciled with God once again. There is nothing we ourselves can do to reconcile ourselves with God. So why does He forgive us over and over again? His mercy and compassion are so great that if we are repentant and humble before God, He grants us reconciliation. Because we've experienced God's mercy, we need to become an example and allow others to experience His mercy by forgiving when wrongs have been committed against us. Before Jesus relays the parable, Peter asks if he must forgive up to 7 times. How many times do we forgive somebody before we think enough is enough? Jesus tells Peter that we must forgive up to 70 times 7. We can imagine that Jesus didn't mean to set up a new number of times that we must forgive a person. Rather, we must keep forgiving so often that it becomes part of our nature. Jesus commands that we forgive our brother and sister and extend the grace that God has abundantly given us. However, as the end of the parable says, our forgiveness has to come from our hearts if we want to please God. If we cannot forgive and do it sincerely, we will be judged quite harshly and face consequences from Him. And if our ability to forgive has a limit or is not done with a desire for true reconciliation, then can we ask for God's grace and forgiveness? In order to preserve love, reconciliation must become a crucial element in our relationships with each other. In the parable, the servant would not forgive his fellow servant the small debt owed to him, which was a small fraction of what the servant owed to the master in comparison. Instead, he went and threw him into prison till he should pay the debt. This suggests that the servant had a greater love for his money than he did for his servant, even though his master had showed him mercy and love by forgiving his much larger debt. Do you hold something in higher value than the love for your neighbor? We see that forgiveness is a necessity in reconciliation. So let's review what it means for us to forgive our neighbor. First, we cannot seek revenge on someone who has wronged us. We also cannot ask that God punishes those who have hurt us. Next, we should not reproach the person for their wrong or even bring it up again. And lastly, we hope that the person finds salvation and forgiveness in Christ. Only God can erase the sin, but we are able to do these things. Do you accept that God extends mercy to those that have wronged you in the same way that He has shown mercy to you? Are you okay with them being forgiven? We must be willing to forgive and let go of our neighbor's offenses against us. If we can do this, then we show that we truly believe in and follow the gospel. Through this willingness to reconcile, we can show our love for our neighbor and for our God. Please turn to your guides for discussion questions.